What's up, guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. It has been a good long time since I've done a building update of any kind, so this is a long overdue update. Usually when I start these building updates, it's kind of like I have this feeling like we haven't done a whole heck of a lot since the last time that we've done an update, but realistically speaking, we've gotten a lot done in the past 6 to 12 months. And it's kind of been refreshing to go back and seeing some of these things just to see how far we've come. So in many ways, I'm recording this video for my future self to go back and reminisce. What spurred me on to do an update now was I actually looked back at a couple of older videos from about a year ago that some other folks had done on their channel when they came and visited me. And I was just like looking around at that footage thinking, there is so much stuff that has been done since then that it's good to get caught back up. And it's really cool just to look back to see all that because you can see just how far we've come since then. So I guess we can start with these 5 tanks up front here. This latest system has been really interesting because in many ways it's worked out phenomenally, and in many ways it completely went off the rails. The original plan was to not have it used for farming whatsoever. The rest of this entire place, plus the building next door, that's all farming space. What we really wanted to do with these systems was to have a shipping-oriented system. So all of the stuff that's on the website would make its way into these tanks. It would be neatly organized. There is a gigantic 40-foot packing station with 2 bag staplers. Everything is like this opulent quartz countertop, super duper nice, really well lit. And, it just never really came to fruition. The guys were very comfortable with doing all their packing next door in the greenhouse. That's where they were super comfortable. So the only person that ever really used these staplers was me on weekend appointments. And I'm not usually even here on the weekends to take the appointments. So a lot of this is largely unutilized for that shipping functionality. So instead, what tended to happen, this is the second part of like the goofiness. The second thing that happened was a lot of this just stayed empty for like the longest time. Let's get into that. I'm kind of picking on this tank because it is the emptiest to get my point across. These systems, 500 gallons apiece plus a 500-gallon sump, ballpark 2,500 to 3,000 gallons. They stayed empty for a good 6 months. Whenever we put anything into these tanks, they would bleach out very quickly because there was simply no nutrient. I mean, it was just this barren, empty, giant tank. We were always very reluctant because we were trying to do the whole thing with, just having stuff on the website in here. But if it almost immediately bleaches, that kind of defeats the purpose of using this to then immediately ship out to your customers, right? So that really wasn't working out. And we were just very gun shy about putting in a lot more corals because, again, it's like, what's the point if they're all going to bleach? Funny thing, and I'm so late to this party. Back when Jake Adams was still with us, he was asking like, why don't you just like put in a ton of corals and just like cycle your systems that way? Roughly at the same time, one of my friends in the UK, her name's Laura Carlin. She is a wholesaler and she asked roughly the same question. She's like, all we do is we just cycle tanks with a ton of coral. This was kind of an alien technique to me, because I've always been one of those guys that basically has an empty aquarium with some rock maybe, and we'll seed it with a little bit of nutrient of some kind, maybe some shrimp or something like that, maybe put in a bacterial additive, but long story short, we would just wait a long time. Fish and coral are super different in so many ways, and this is one of those huge ways, is that I don't think it is possible to put in too many corals into a system and have like a nutrient spike like you would have with fish. If you want to put 50 fish into a tank right off the rip, you're probably going to run into some some bad times, right? If you put 500 corals into a system like this, in many ways, the corals themselves are the filtration. They come with all the beneficial bacteria. They don't put like a nutrient tax on the system. Once I just decided to throw in a ton of corals into these tanks, like we had massive overgrowth of this type of chalice, for example, this like a Raja Rampage chalice. It was growing out of our ears practically. And I was like, you know what? We are using valuable SPS tank real estate with a lot of these large polyp stonies that don't really need that level of care. So why don't we just take all of that overgrowth and just toss it into these tanks? Oh, we've got an overgrowth of Montipora. Toss them into these tanks. Clean them up a little bit, frag them up, do whatever you want to do. But long story short, get them over here. We have tanks full of like Euphyllia and Fimbriophilia here now. A lot of our initial issues with these systems kind of went away. The big problem again was the corals bleaching. But another problem that comes from having a tank that's too clean is you get a lot of like the weird slimes, like the cyanobacteria, you get the dinoflagellate issues, and this tank was rampant with it. All 5 of these tanks were just rampant with it. And again, that also makes one gun shy about putting in extra corals. But in doing the whole extra coral thing, solved, I would say, like 90% of that issue. And the remaining issue that we did have could be solved by, adding in a lot more detritivores and just doing like maintenance siphoning. So I would go through with a scraper and a siphon tube and just constantly just like take sheets and sheets and sheets of that slime away. And over time, the coralline was able to get a foothold. Over time, the herbivores, we get them in enough quantity that they were able to really start to polish these tanks up. So yeah, those 2 things really threw me for a loop. It's like the lack of actual shipping that happens out of these tanks and the entire concept of just dumping in massive amounts of corals being the answer. Who knew? Not me. But now I kind of have an understanding of how I would set up my next set of tanks. One thing that I probably should mention, which was kind of nice about these systems, I did say that we don't do a lot of shipping out of them, but it did allow us to use a lot of the real estate for the live sales that we do, because we're able to organize it on these laser cut grids. And this really was designed from the get-go to be very, very, very easy to do the shipping stuff, right? So this is by far the most ergonomic of all of the things that we do in order to get like just the perfect height to work in for all this. It's the perfect height to do all the shooting and everything like that. So it has worked out for those types of like bigger online sales. Okay, this is another fun little section that I'll call your attention to. You see this one tray that is just full of gold hammer? This came out of our Fimbriophilia show tank. And we really weren't planning on doing any kind of like propagation out of those show tanks. However, there was this branching gold hammer that we had, and it had fallen off of its rock and had broken basically in half. You never really get a full appreciation for how big that colony was until it's broken in half, and we remounted one half of it back onto the aquascape. And the other half, we said, you know what, let's just frag it up. And it takes up every bit of what looks like a 2-foot by 2-foot square. In the show tank, it looked like it was only about this big. But once you frag it apart, it's like 100 heads. And that was only half of that colony. So the next time I show you guys the Fimbriophilia show tank, just get like a mental picture of just how big those colonies have to be to take up that kind of space. It's by far the nicest of the show tanks that we have here, I think. Yeah, you can just see we're farming these hammers like nobody's business. Let's finish it up with a discussion of the filtration that we've got going on. This is the last of the three MRC Pro 4 skimmers that we were looking to get. It was the one that was ordered last. We didn't really think that we needed this guy immediately anyway, because we were using the smaller protein skimmer. Our nutrients had already basically bottomed out, so we didn't have any real need to get this guy up and running. Eventually, though, bit the bullet. It's here. It's the Abyss modified MRC Pro 4, which is, again, super, super cool. We really wanted to make sure that since we're running Ozone, that it does get properly processed in something like this rather than a smaller skimmer. However, funny thing about Ozone, I went back and forth with Raj at MRC about this, because the air intake that goes into the Abyss pump, it is like this John Guest fitting, and for whatever reason, the John Guest fitting kept snapping like basically in half, and we would have to kind of get replacements, and it kept happening. I was like, is it because of the ozone? And Raj was like, no, I don't think so, because a lot of public aquariums use these. A lot of public aquariums run ozone, and this is like the first time we've ever, seen this problem happen. And I'm like, okay, okay. It could have just been a weird batch of John Guest fittings. I don't know, right? It's really my first time ever having this issue, because this is like the first time that there was a John Guest fitting on an air intake like that. Anyway, fast forward a few months, and we've had like 5 of them break now. 3 different skimmers. The replacements were also breaking, and yeah, I think we're going to have to move on to plan B. What was really funny is I was rewatching a podcast that I had done with Jake at the Reef Builder Studio. Just a one-liner random throwaway in our discussion. He said that John Guest fittings in particular are not ozone resistant. When we originally had that conversation a few years back, I thought nothing of it. But then when you look today, it's like I'm having exactly this issue. So I sent that time-stamped podcast to Rod. I'm like, okay, I get that there's all these public aquarium clients that you have that are also running Ozone, but let me just interject that now we have 2 data points, one from Jake, one from myself, that says, hey, this might be a little bit of an issue. If it happens again, we will have to like redesign that little section to get the air intake. Cool. Today, another one of these things broke. So I was like, Raj, is it entirely possible that your public aquariums don't have working ozone systems? They should probably check that, because our ozone definitely works and these things are definitely breaking. By the way, that in no way makes the skimmer non-functional. You can just like jam the airline further into the thing and it'll just run fine. The only problem is when you go to service this thing and you turn off the pumps, the water will spray out. If it's just running, not a big issue. But anyway, that was kind of like a fun little tidbit. As far as what this thing is doing nutrient-wise, we have noticed that on the other systems, they have dramatically reduced our nutrient. So our phosphates and nitrates are slowly coming down in those systems. In this system, though, you're probably thinking, didn't you say that you had a nutrient deficit problem to begin with? And this probably is not helping that. True. However, we just decided to feed like crazy. We typically don't throw in quite as much food into the other systems, but in this one where we can just go super heavy, we've been trying to stock it with more fish. We probably feed this thing triple the amount of food. The nutrients are still low. We still try to supplement a little bit of nitrate and phosphate directly. So far, so good on that front. I would, in a perfect world, like to add more fish though. Hopefully we can work on that in our next update. Okay, guys, that concludes this portion of the update. We're covering the latest of our systems here. This is set C, the 2,500 gallon not quite shipping system. I gotta say, I love to plan stuff out as best I can, but it's one of those like of mice and men sort of things where like you might end up in a completely different place than when you originally thought. It is fun to look back where the thought process was going to take you and really where the project ends up. I'm actually pretty thrilled with how this system has worked out. It's by far the most elegantly planned of our systems, and I think that as we fill it up and increase the bioload, it's going to really flourish. After doing this hobby for so long, it's over 30 something years at this point, it's still very possible to learn new things. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed this section of the update. We'll be back real soon. Take care. Happy reefing.